So this is our program for the week of March 3rd, 2025. We've got a lot to cover, and so I do want to bring back Samer. Welcome back, Samer. It's good to have you after several weeks. We got a lot to cover, so I'm gonna hand the floor off to you in a little bit. But I know there's some significant breaking news this morning on Trump's announcement to pull $400 million in grants from Columbia under the premise that Columbia failed to protect Jewish students. In other words, that it somehow failed to crack down harder on free speech against genocide in Gaza. And this is a huge deal, clearly weaponizing the federal purse strings to stifle dissent and promote a Zionist agenda. And it comes on the heels of, I think more shameful news across the country for weeks, if not months, and from Democratic and ostensibly other progressive actors and universities that have been taking reprisals against Palestine solidarity, organizing on campuses, including Kathy Hochul's pulling of a Palestine studies job just a couple weeks ago from CUNY, and this is, I guess, like more than a shot across the bow at this point. It's like a real mob style shakedown, and an example setting that looks like the administration wants to make out of Colombia that undoubtedly will have some clear repercussions on free speech writ large, but especially on campuses, especially if administrators on campuses don't act to resist and capitulate, which unfortunately we've seen more of than not. So yeah, your thoughts on that, and again on what we're seeing in the current moment with this escalation against Palestine Solidarity organizing.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, and great to be back. It's been a minute. Yeah, I mean, I think I was probably as stunned as anyone else to see that news this morning. $400 million in federal grants being pulled from Colombia. And anyone who's been paying attention to sort of what's been happening in Colombia, like it's hard to imagine what the university could do more against the Palestine movement than they've already done. The people who have been protesting the war and literally just calling for, at this point, a meeting with the president and some financial transparency on investments in the military-industrial complex. Like at this point, that's it. And even those demands are resulting in those students being beaten, harassed, expelled, otherwise like disciplined and punished. There's a student who just got in trouble for writing an op-ed calling for divestment in the school
I saw that.
newspaper.
Yeah.
And so like, yeah, the level of desperation here, I think is really something. And I think there's some optimism to be gleaned from that, which is the total like white knuckle terror that like the government and the political class seem to be using in response to this sort of Palestine organizing, I think is really telling. The fact that they're so terrified of anything at all. And obviously, in many ways, Colombia was just an example that they wanted to set, right, as this like originator of the encampment movement. So not altogether super surprising there, but once again, a really stark reminder, one, of the Trump's administration's total willingness to deploy whatever they possibly can to silence any sort of Palestine movement work, but also um, the total complicity of our university system in these like broader military structures, right? And at the end of the day, like, this is where Columbia is getting its money. It's getting it from the federal government, but even more to the point, they're getting it from like defense contractors and research grants and things like that that are going into things that uh, feed the administrative apparatus of the university way more than tuition or like any sort of local accountability ever would. So yeah, I think the follow-on effects of this are going to be really big. And we're going to continue to see universities crack down even harder than they have. And I think we're going to see new and novel ways that students will find to resist that. The fact that they're still doing these encampments, is really quite a remarkable response.
Yeah, absolutely. And because it's going to have so many, as you said, knock-on effects, this is not just about Palestine solidarity. This is about free speech under an authoritarian regime. I think how these contradictions get resolved within the anti-Trump forces, and how it highlights the lingering contradictions from last year, and that remain about how to resolve these differences around Palestine solidarity and also the Zionist kind of thread among Democrats in particular. A lot means it remains to be seen, but I think on our end, we know what we need to do, and what we need to be calling for, and that's for, full-on resistance against these types of repressive measures. We in our preview for this show, we wanted to highlight a conversation we had with Bushra Khalidi, who's a humanitarian worker in Ramallah, who coordinates with folks in Gaza. I'm going to play just a little clip, Samar, of our conversation with her as she talks a little bit about what Israel has been doing to blockade, and then after that, we'll just head it over to you to start our news and analysis for today.
Of humanitarian efforts in Gaza for the last 18 months. I mean, first the cutting of the water and electricity. That was the, first kind of big, impact on Gaza is you're cutting off water and electricity to 2.1 million people, half of which of these people are children. But then the crossing, there are 7 crossings into Gaza. Only 1 or 2 or 3 are open simultaneously. They close, one opens, then this is one is closed. Now all are closed until further notice. So, that level of control on the borders is, of course, and that's why we saw kilometers or miles, as we say in the US, of aid trucks just waiting at the border. And Israel says, well, it's because the UN can't sort itself out. Well, first of all, yeah, we're attacked left, right, and center. We lost colleagues in the last 18 months, a record number of colleagues that we've never seen killed in any other conflict in history. So that also obviously impacts. We don't have the capacity that we used to. But also like the critical materials that Israel continues to block under the umbrella of dual-use materials. Education materials are dual-use materials. Metal poles are dual-use materials. Desalination units to desalinate water and turn it into water that you can use for house purposes or cleaning purposes. Again, dual use. So, and then the delays at the border crossings, like I said, the fact that, one crossing opens, another closes every day. It led to spoilage of food and medical supplies. And then the selective approval of aid trucks, like the number of trucks permitted daily, is a fraction of what pre-war levels were, despite the absolutely overwhelming need in Gaza. And then, of course, the targeting of aid infrastructure. Israeli forces attacked aid distribution sites, convoys, roads, warehouses, which prevented, of course, the effective delivery of assistance. And the human cost of these obstruction has been absolutely staggering. Thousands have died from preventable conditions due to lack of medical care. And we saw starvation and disease outbreak that were escalated with reports of children dying from malnutrition and dehydration. And a week ago, 10 children dying because of the cold, because it's so freezing, because they're on the beach and they're in makeshift tents with no proper even entering that amount of tents takes a long time and it's pricey if you want to get proper tents for people to actually like survive a season. And we also know of many people having been forced to drink contaminated water, which led to the spikes of polio at the time. And we know there are risks of cholera, but there's not even an ability to test it. And diarrheal diseases, that's been like constant for the last 18 months in Gaza. So Israel has obstructed aid in so many ways. And now, even during the ceasefire, even though the bombs have stopped, and that is, a huge difference, the blocking of aid and dual-use materials is still impeding the effective delivery of our humanitarian operations.
So again, that was Bushra Khalidi, a humanitarian aid worker in Ramallah. We'll play a little bit more of our conversation with her towards the end of the PSA. She also covers a little bit of, what the health impacts are on those who remain in Gaza, and it's obviously been a pretty dire picture for the last 18 months, and really highlights how much every aid truck, every ounce of aid matters, and the difference it makes in saving lives. And the importance of continuing to push for humanitarian to aid to not be part of this, the ceasefire negotiations, but to be something that is going in and out of Gaza as needed. And then also, she's in the West Bank, and so she also highlights a little bit of what is going on in the West Bank and the impact of the raids and the aggression by Israel in Jenin and in Tulkarm and some of the other camps there. So it's worth checking out. We'll make sure that it's part of the recording, and we'll try to play it those clips at the end of today's PSA. But Samra, without further ado, I will hand over the floor to you. Well, Samra, I think you're still muted.
Yep, thank you for that. Yeah, I'll jump right in just so that hopefully we can have time to watch some of that because I feel like Bush's stuff is really important and really good for people to sort of focus in on. So jumping right into it, we usually start each week with the updated casualty counts, but those haven't been updated for a little while now. So, the small blessings, I guess, because not that the death count is not increasing, but it's increasing rather incrementally just because of some small Israeli skirmishes and also, of course, like discovering bodies under the rubble and stuff. But what we do know, of course, now that the ceasefire has been in place or the cessation of hostilities has been in place through the month of February, we're starting to get a better sense of what the underlying infrastructure in Gaza is looking like, and the evidence that underlies a lot of the Israeli war crimes that have been committed over the course of this past year and a half. And so I'd really recommend these two drop site articles. I think they did a really good job. Um, One of showing the sort of systematic destruction of Gaza's agricultural backbone, which is the way that the economy in Gaza has sustained itself over these past decades, and the ways in which farmland, um, cropland, grazing land, and access to drinking water have been systematically eradicated over the course of the Israeli occupation and attacks. And then similarly, and sort of tangentially, that this incredible article, frankly, about the efforts being made right now to document the crimes that Israel has committed in Gaza and how hard that has been. And so, in this moment where one really big barrier has come down, which is the sort of ongoing hot war that has existed in Gaza for a year and a half, which has made it really hard for any sort of like meaningful investigation or monitoring or disclosure. Now people are on the ground sort of trying to sift through evidence, but there's a series of additional hurdles that they're now facing, including um, information that is getting out isn't really being disseminated meaningfully because of all the sort of, media roadblocks. So there's, the shadow banning and blocking on social media platforms, but also just the ways in which traditional media hasn't covered a lot of this and isn't really interested in covering some of these things, including this cropland story that you probably haven't seen anywhere else. But in addition to that, the sort of resources that are generally put to these sort of investigative activities aren't being funded for Gaza, unsurprisingly, given, there's an incredible sub-story in here about this like investigative outfit tasked with identifying war crimes that had been lavishly funded by Western donors to cover war crimes happening in Syria. And then that organization being like, oh, we can use these same tools in Gaza, and then them losing basically all of their support and funding. So yeah, would definitely recommend both of those. But the big shadow looming over all of that right now as it exists is, of course, the status of this expired ceasefire, where, the negotiations for phase two, we've talked about this a lot in past PSAs, but as a very quick recap, negotiations for phase two, which is the transition into an actual ceasefire from a cessation of hostilities, was supposed to begin in mid-February, and the Israeli negotiating team was specifically prohibited from talking about phase two. And here we are now. The phase one of the agreement has officially ended, last week. So we're in this really weird limbo moment where they're the war, in its sort of like totality hasn't restarted, but the existing framework that prevents it from happening has also subsided. So we're in this really weird moment where it's not really clear what's going to happen next, and different parties have really divergent interests in how to move things forward. And so Israel clearly has been pushing very hard just to extend the first phase of the ceasefire, you know, um, trying to keep this temporary cessation of hostilities going, according to them, through Ramadan and Passover, which would be like an additional 6 weeks or so, which has been rejected by Hamas outright because, again, that the interest in this first stage, as we understand it from the negotiating parties in Gaza, was that it would lead to a permanent cessation and not this sort of like temporary, um, the extension of phase one would basically be Hamas giving additional political prisoners um, in exchange for this truce continuing. But as Hamas and the other parties there lose the leverage that comes with those political prisoners. Like it doesn't make sense for them to lose all of their remaining leverage and then return to a hot war when they will then have no leverage. So that doesn't seem to be a realistic way forward. In response to that, Israel has completely sealed the borders to Gaza again, in a way that we haven't seen since, like during the war itself, where all humanitarian aid, but also stabilization aid and other sort of like economic flows are completely cut off. And they've said very bluntly that they are sealing it off as a negotiating tactic to force the hand of Hamas to accept this sort of extension of phase one of the deal. And never mind that that's like literally a war crime. That's collective punishment, against 2 million people or however many may be left, to force this group of negotiators to change tactics. But obviously, I'm sure everyone on this call is well aware of the extent to which this is a really dire development where, there has been a lot of like food aid, for example, that has been coming in for a long time. And so that this doesn't mean like immediate risk of starvation, but even just the sort of speculative pricing of the markets that has resulted from this sealing of the border means that food that is available in Gaza has skyrocketed in price, making it unaffordable for a lot of people. So, um, yeah, the consequences of this are huge, and it's not just food aid. Obviously, it's the sort of like continuing medical treatment, the stabilization aid that needs to come in, the rubble clearing, and things like that. So all of that is currently on pause. It's worth noting that in the context of that, some Israeli officials have expressed, not Netanyahu, mind you, but some other Israeli officials have expressed some willingness to open phase two talks. But critically here, what they're agreeing to is not like meaningfully moving into a phase two, but rather that they're open to negotiating the possibility of a phase two in exchange for hostage releases, and that like the hostages would be released just for them to consider the negotiations, not to like the hostages wouldn't be released when those negotiations resulted in an agreement. So again, it's not really that different from what Netanyahu is saying, which is we basically just want an extension of phase one, where those negotiations were supposed to be, right? Were written into the rules for what phase one was supposed to be. So I think we can understand that largely just as an extension, the same sort of thing where they're trying to extend phase one of the deal. Meanwhile, they're also saying um, uh, that the Israelis are considering a quote brief resumption of war, and just like the sort of cavalier way that that's thrown out there, as if it's just a sort of negotiating tactic and not, you know, terrorism, like literally trying to terrify a population into accepting a particular political position. Um, and you know, sort of compounding that was Trump's statement a couple days ago after meeting with some of the released political prisoners that were in Israel. Sorry, the political prisoners that were being held in Gaza, met with Trump, and then like a few hours later, he posted this rant on Truth Social, basically saying like, not a single Hamas member will be safe if you don't do as I say. All the hostages need to be released right now. It's not dissimilar to what he said, a few weeks back when there was that kerfuffle. The last time, basically, Hamas tried to sort of pause the process to get it back into the sort of agreed upon bounds. Um, a wild comment in the middle there about how only sick and twisted people keep bodies, referring to the dead political prisoners that are still in Gaza. Trump obviously not realizing that Israel holds hundreds, if not thousands, of dead bodies of Palestinians that they keep at ransom. So, not that that would change anything, obviously, but obviously the pressure here is building, and the possibility for a resumption of like the actual hot war is escalating. It's really hard to see it in any other way than that. But it is largely at this point a negotiating tactic and not necessarily the inherent goal of any party. It seems clear to me, at least, that nobody actually wants the like military assault to restart now, not even Israel. Which is not to say that Israel doesn't want a resumption of that war at some point, but I think everybody right now is benefiting from a little bit of time to like regroup, re-strategize, rebuild morale and sort of build up the sort of logistics and resources needed for when that war starts up again. And so I think that's why we're seeing a lot of talk about a war starting up, but not a lot of movement towards it. And again, this is a thing that we talk about all the time on the PSAs. Uh, if they're putting out press releases saying we're mulling the brief resumption of war, like if they were actually about to do that, they wouldn't be putting out press releases. They would just start attacking again, as they've always done. So we should see this more, I think, right now as signaling than as a portend of what's to come immediately. But no mistakes. Obviously, at some point, Israel wants to start attacking Gaza again because their goal is to make it unlivable. So that is something that I think we'll be seeing at some point. It doesn't seem like Hamas is really going along with any of this. Even in response to that Truth Social rant, basically they're just saying um, we're sticking with the agreement that was signed in January. So our position is just that the agreement that was signed across all parties is the thing that is going to be what leads us through this process. And it's obvious that both Israel and the United States have sort of been okay with that plan collapsing. But as of yet, Hamas is still sort of holding on to the possibility that phase two can move forward, while of course probably planning for it falling apart. And there was um, a kind of rough dig by Abu Ubaidah, the Hamas spokesperson, against like all the other Arab countries, basically saying, we're not asking you to defend Arab and Muslim children in Gaza by moving your army and tanks, God forbid, but have your inability and weakness reached the point that you're unable to move relief trucks and humanitarian aid, basically trying to like shame the rest of the region into doing something to allow aid to start coming in again. But again, with the United States sort of supporting this move of freezing all aid, it's going to be tough for that to change. But critically, and in a way that we've talked about back last year, and how the unpredictable nature of what a Trump administration would mean for Gaza, whereas obviously he has no interest in supporting the Palestinian people and no love for peace or Palestine in any meaningful way. At the same time, like Trump remains as a wild card. Um, and he produces outcomes that are really unexpected. And one of those really came out this week, which is the revelation, likely leaked by Israeli sources, that the U.S. is directly negotiating with Hamas, which is a thing that at least hasn't happened in decades, if ever. Um, and the special envoy for hostages, so not Steve Witkoff, but a different person, has been talking directly to representatives from Hamas, ostensibly specifically about the release of the 5 U.S. hostages that are being held in Gaza, but something that has come out from like leaks about this negotiation process is that they've also been talking to Hamas directly about like an acceptable move into phase two and what that would actually look like. And it seems that the Israelis are furious about this, right? They also do not directly negotiate with Hamas, and they really don't like the idea of anybody else doing it either, right? Like the way that these negotiations have been going are indirect. So the Qataris and the Egyptians, talk to one group, and then on another floor they go and they talk to the other group. But this is one of those things where, like, regardless of how you feel about an ostensible adversary, like, it's better to talk to them directly. Like, this is obviously good, and is more likely to result in a real solution because information isn't being bottlenecked through Israel or other third parties. So it's clear that Israel's really upset about that because it does make a long-term solution more likely, and that's something that they don't want. So, it's hard to say what it will actually lead to, but just the fact that they leaked this information to Axios, our old friend Barak Ravid, who's constantly getting direct leaks from the Israeli government, was designed, I think, to stop those talks. But it doesn't seem that the talks have stopped. They have stalled a little bit. The way that it's referred to is they've hit a snag. But it does seem like, and Trump has really doubled down on the idea that, like, no, we're going to continue to talk to them. So that is one small positive development, I think, coming out of this. We'll see what it actually produces. But the more people talk directly, the more likely it is that people reach some sort of negotiated resolution, which is what presumably we all want. Um, at the same time, there are these bigger talks about what's going to happen post-war, or like when the ceasefire actually takes effect, if it ever does. And, the Arab states have been scrambling to put together this plan basically to counter Trump's so-called Riviera plan, which is the permanent displacement of all Palestinians, and then the U.S. owning Gaza and turning it into a resort area. This unhinged fantasy, right along along with his like annexation of Greenland and Panama and all of that. Uh, this DW article, I feel like is a bit of a misnomer because it talks about the Arab leaders endorsing Egypt's plan, but actually the Arab League came up with their own plan, which is similar to the Egyptian plan, but different in some really critical respects, um, largely around the role of the Palestinian Authority, which the UAE pushed very strongly as being included in the plan as being the sole governing authority. So like this sort of transitional period where international overseers, oh, uh, sort of monitor the reconstruction of Gaza, and then it's handed over to the Palestinian Authority. That was rejected outright by Israel, which has no interest in the Palestinian Authority being in Gaza, particularly because the idea of a singular authority in both the West Bank and Gaza sort of revives the idea of a Palestinian state, which is a thing that the Israeli government is explicitly said that it won't condone. But similarly, I think the other big thing in the plan that uh, caused such furious denunciation from both the US and Israel is that it doesn't really tackle this question about the governance of Hamas. So, like, one thing that both Israel and the U.S. have said is a red line for them is Hamas's continuing governance of Gaza. And this plan just doesn't really address what happens to Hamas in any meaningful way. It just sort of sidesteps the question. And it is something that I think at some point in these negotiations is going to have to be dealt with. Hamas themselves have actually said that they would give up governance in Gaza in the context of signing a permanent ceasefire. Uh, So that is a conceivable outcome, but the sort of corollary piece there that really isn't addressed at all is the disarming of Hamas, which again is the sort of uh, a stated core thing that both Israel and the United States are demanding, and that Hamas is refusing, basically saying that they won't disarm until there is a Palestinian state, right? And there's that statement that we talked about months ago where Hamas put out a thing saying we'll disarm and we'll leave if there's a Palestinian state on 1967 borders. But that's obviously not going to happen. So how that resolves itself is sort of anyone's guess at this point. It's not really a thing that can realistically be handled one way or another by the Trump plan or the Arab plan or whatever it may be. So right now, all of this is just sort of sitting in this like limbo state where nothing really meaningful is happening with it. And obviously Trump and Israel rejected this Arab League plan, but I wouldn't read too much into that. Like, I think this whole process is one of negotiations. So this is meant to be like the sort of counter offer for what Trump said. And so I think we're going to see a series of these where uh, different states and probably primarily pushed by the Arab League will propose a set of different solutions until maybe one gains enough traction to be able to move things forward. So despite the fact that this uh, alternative reconstruction plan was rejected by the United States, which is like, why does the United States have veto power over this? But that's another story. Despite that, I don't think that the reconstruction plan that they're proposing is dead. I think it just means that there's going to be continued permutations of it over time. Not too much I want to say on the West Bank, particularly since I think we can hear Bushra talk about it in more detail, but just to say, the sort of ongoing theme that we've been discussing here about the Gazification of the West Bank, the way in which the tactics deployed in Gaza are being used, particularly in Jenin, Nablus, and Tulkarem, um, are like sort of escalating in the extent to which the sort of wanton destruction of broad public property, the sort of use of no-go zones and snipers and broad population displacement are becoming the new norm. And I think it's important, like we talked about how setting that standard as being internationally acceptable in Gaza was going to create these carry-on effects, and we're now seeing that in the West Bank very clearly. And I think it's important for us to recognize that it's not going to stop in the West Bank. Like the fact that this is becoming normalized is going to have carry-on effects literally everywhere, including, what Israel does possibly to the population within 48, but also what it's about to do in Syria, and what other countries will then consider to be acceptable norms for war. Um, so the fact that this sort of continues with impunity should really unsettle us all. In Lebanon, the sort of zombie ceasefire agreement continues to sort of limp forward, where Israel has withdrawn its forces to what they say is 5 locations in southern Lebanon, and they are still there with absolutely no timetable for when they'll leave. Lebanon has said multiple times very publicly that they consider this to be an occupation of Lebanese land and a violation of the ceasefire agreement that was signed. But just this week, the State Department unfroze just shy of $100 million for the Lebanese army, uh, and then put out a series of things saying like, oh yeah, the Lebanese government accepted this money with the understanding that it means that the Israeli military can stay in those 5 locations for what they said are weeks or months, whatever that means, which effectively I think means indefinitely. Lebanon has denied that they in any way agreed to that, and who knows, honestly, at this point. Um, but the underlying idea here, of course, is basically that Israel will stay in those locations as the U.S. and other powers build up the Lebanese army as a counterweight to Hezbollah, and that's why this $100 million, with like Trump's tight-fisted international spending, he's happy to spend $100 million on this because one, $100 million is nothing, and two, this idea of like building up a military counterweight to like the resistance axis, which I have to say is a very, very old playbook for the United States, and something very similar that they have done in Syria, obviously, and also in Palestine, building up a military counterweight to Hamas, which was the sort of um, catalyzing factor that led to the big clash of the factions between Hamas and Fatah, and um, it never works. It has literally never in the history of the United States doing this sort of building up a military counterweight has effectively resulted in anything but that military counterweight getting absolutely decimated. But apparently they are trying it again in Lebanon, so we'll see how that goes. Last week was the funeral for Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, where I happened to be not in Lebanon at the time, but close by, and hundreds of thousands of people were there. So I think the idea that Hezbollah is kneecapped, I think, is a little bit overstated. Well, definitely kneecapped, but the idea that they're on their like last legs, I think, is definitely a little bit overstated. But what political or military power they actually meaningfully have is something that we're not going to know until or if the ceasefire collapses. It's really, really hard to say at this point. Um, but yeah, a little bit of a mess for everybody. Meanwhile, Israel's making moves in Syria, big time. And this was, I was in Syria for the past 2 weeks, and I saw this happening on the ground, where Israel has been making all of these statements about defending southern Syria, and particularly the Druze communities in southern Syria, and basically prohibiting the Syrian army from going anywhere south of Damascus, which is a huge swath of the country, saying that is Israel will basically maintaining its military control over that entire area. And a few things that I think are really worth reflecting on here. One, this isn't new. The Druze, like there are a lot of Israeli Druze members of the IDF, and they've been in contact with Druze communities in Syria for years, like over the course of the Syrian civil war, including a series of semi-secret meetings in the Emirates. Um, but it's clearly an escalation now, over these past few months, where as Israel has, expanded its military control in Syria to include all of these areas in Quneitra and all the way up to Mount Hernon, they are directly engaging with the Syrian Druze communities in the south. And there's so much to say about this that I could easily take up the whole hour talking about this. So I'm going to try to do it very quickly. I think AROC will be doing an event on Syria sometime very soon to talk about some of these things in more detail. But just to say, like, the playbook here is the very old plan, literally written out in the 50s and 40s, to break Syria into a series of smaller ethno-states to ensure, one, that it doesn't have the sort of political or military power to challenge Israel in any meaningful way, and two, to sort of normalize the idea of the ethno-state, right? So if there is this like autonomous Druze area in southern Syria, that Israel perceives that as a legitimization of like a Jewish state, right? This idea that you can have states that are designed just for one group of people, um, as opposed to sort of like the pluralistic broader Syrian country, right? Um, yeah, there's so much to say about this, but I'll leave it at that for now. And please be on the lookout for an event on this because there's a lot to cover here. But I also wanted to very quickly just mention what's happening in the north of Syria and the northeast in particular, where in Turkey we now have another ceasefire. So we are now dealing with three ceasefires in the region that are all in this sort of weird state, where the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, their leader basically declared a ceasefire with Turkey. Hasn't really, as far as I've seen, actually taken effect yet. As of yesterday, Turkish troops were attacking Kurdish militants in the mountains. So whether or not this actually happens or not, it's a little bit unclear, but uh, it has really important implications for what's happening in Syria, where the Kurdish party in the northeast has very deep ties to the PKK. And basically, in many ways, many people interpreted what Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdish leader in Turkey, said as a call for the Syrian Kurds to disarm. But the Syrian Kurds responded to that basically saying that, like, no, that was a call for the PKK to disarm, and we're not the PKK, we're our own different thing down here. Um, so that is not going to happen, but it is another complicating factor in the sort of long dialogue that's happening between the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led militias in the northeast of Syria, with the new Syrian government about the disarming of the Kurdish militias up there or their integration into the Syrian army. Again, there's a million things to say about that too. A couple of really quick International Criminal Court updates. Old friend Andrew Cuomo, who is now also again running for New York mayor, lovely, has joined the legal team to defend Netanyahu in the ICC war crimes accusations. And there's this update in the nation from some of the people who filed suit to the ICC, basically calling for them to investigate Biden, uh, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin for abetting a genocide. This was a really great article, so also definitely worth a read. And then military aid, as always, there's another batch going out. Trump, bypassing Congress, is directly trying to send another $3 billion in so-called emergency arms to Israel. This is overwhelmingly over 2 billion of this $3 billion package is those 2,000-pound so-called bunker buster bombs that Biden had very briefly paused, and Trump is very clear, very keen, obviously, to sort of get back going. Um, there is a bill in the House right now introduced by Rashida Tlaib and Pramila Jayapal to block that weapons sale. And it's got, I think, 13 or so co-sponsors already, which is pretty great. Um, and, you know, particularly given that Trump is going around Congress to do this, there may be some opportunities for advocacy here to try to stop this weapons shipment, particularly given how egregious it is and the idea of using these 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs in Gaza and the West Bank is obviously horrifying. And you know, they never stopped using them. But if they get $2 billion worth more of them, we're going to see a lot more of that. And that's something that, you know, I think none of us want to see happen. And then we opened today talking a little bit about the campus crackdown stuff. This, you know, before the Columbia thing happened, the administration had been threatening to pull federal funds. The Justice Department has opened an anti-Semitism investigation into the entire UC system, basically for similar reasons. And again, like hard to imagine the UCs doing more to crush the Palestine movement than they did do, including just standing around and watching as a group of Zionist thugs beat up peaceful protesters at UCLA. Um, but yeah, so once again, we're seeing this sort of ramping up in repression in that way. They are similarly now using this like AI tool to troll through people's social media posts to find anyone that they perceive to be pro-Hamas, and then use that to revoke their student visas, which is a terrifying, terrifying development, and a really important reminder for folks that like what you post on social media is often really public for people to see, and you should be thoughtful about that. Um, so yeah, and like, we all know how janky a lot of this AI stuff is. So like, God knows how many false flags they're gonna get. And I mean, all of it is false flags because it's not pro-Hamas content. It's literally just end the war content. Um, so yeah, a really, really worrying development there. And like again, we need to think about where these things go from here. And as Thomas said at the top, like this isn't limited to the Palestine movement. And they're using it against Palestine organizers now, which means they will definitely be using it against other types of activists very, very soon. So another thing that we need to be watching out for. Outside of the education crackdown is also this sort of assault on nonprofits and the attempts now to sort of start defunding and criminalizing nonprofits that are supporting Palestine work. And this like absolutely wild story about Westpac, this fiscal sponsor for a bunch of nonprofits, being sued in a number of courts, including by their own insurance firm, and the United States basically joining those lawsuits as a sort of co-party or a supporter of those lawsuits. So terrifying development there, which will have real big implications on the financing of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And not to be outdone, of course, Israel is doing its own crackdown. Where a new bill has been introduced to impose, I think it was an 80% tax on all donations to like Palestinian organizations or foreign funded nonprofits generally, basically meaning that you cannot fund those things because 80% of it gets taken by the state of Israel. And in this like remarkable act of hypocrisy, basically they're saying that like, oh, we don't want foreign funded NGOs to be undermining uh, Israel's national interests and interfering with Israel's sovereignty, literally the same week that they're deploying their army in another country to, quote unquote, defend ethnic communities in Syria, who, by the way, have by and large broadly rejected Israel's offers for support. There have been many statements by Druze leaders in Syria being like, no, thank you. Like, we're Syrian. We've been Syrian for thousands of years. We do not want you here. Thank you. And then a couple of quick BDS news wins. South Africa, Malaysia, and Colombia have all decided to close their ports to arms shipments. So like this is like that Prague group that we've talked about in previous PSAs really sort of picking up steam. Great to see that. And also this really interesting article in Truth Out about how Israel is very quickly ramping up its domestic weapons production in anticipation of losing international arms contracts, like in the ways that sanctions against Israel for its arming, sanctions against companies that are arming Israel are really picking up steam. But that creates like a really targeted set of BDS opportunities that might be really powerful for the movement. So again, a really interesting article to read if you haven't. And I often like to close out with some opinion polling when I can find it because I do love my numbers. And this new poll by Gallup I found to be really striking, showing the change in America's sympathies in what's happening in Palestine, showing record high support for the Palestinian people. It's still 33% versus 46% who express their sympathies more with the Israelis, but as you can imagine, it's highly partisan and like deeply divided demographically. So you can see that Democrats now are significantly more supportive of Palestinians than they are of Israelis, by a pretty significant factor now. Like more than 2 to 1, right? So 21% expressing more sympathy with the Israelis, 60% almost expressing more sympathy with the Palestinians. Although you wouldn't know it, hearing the way that Democratic political officials talk about it. Hopefully, at some point, that'll catch up with their electoral base, but who knows? And then I also like I wanted to pull out the crosstabs on this because I was curious about what those numbers look like broken down by demographics. And it's white men, basically. It's white men that continue to, older white men that continue to support Israel that are really skewing these numbers. You can see that for women, the numbers are more or less even. For people under the age of 35, it's 48% that support Palestinians more and 29% that support Israelis more. So it's really older folks. And of course, Republicans, right, at a rate of like 7 to 1. So just to sum up, the existing ceasefire in Palestine is effectively over, but neither side is really rushing back to war. So like what happens now? What possibly can emerge from this? That's something we don't really know yet, but we'll probably have a lot more insight into in these coming weeks as these negotiations either move forward or don't. And obviously, what needs to happen here is pressure needs to be put on Israel to agree to something. You know, at the end of the day, these are largely in reality negotiations between Hamas and the United States, because the United States are the ones that pushed this first ceasefire to happen, and have the leverage to actually sort of force Israel to the negotiating table to move something forward in the future, if and when that actually occurs. Um, so we'll see whether or not there's any appetite for that. You know, we've talked about this in the past and the different members of the Trump administration, how they perceive this differently. So we'll probably do another deep dive into that as details emerge. But beyond that, long-term reconstruction plans are sort of just being negotiated between powers. We'll see where those develop too, but you know, I wouldn't put too much stock in Trump's Riviera plan, except as a sort of negotiating tactic to force the Arab League into submitting something that's, you know, more palatable to Israel. Meanwhile, the situation in both Lebanon and Syria feels very fragile and quite tenuous, and it seems very likely that we're going to see more Israeli aggression in Syria very, very soon. So we should be on the lookout for that. And then on the domestic front, the repression of the movement really, really is ramping up, both locally and internationally. So, you know, we as a movement really need to think about how we defend ourselves and how we fight back at the same time. So we're not just stuck in this sort of reactive defense mode, but that we are also sort of pushing for liberty, liberation, dignity for all people, and you know, not um, not being shy to say that publicly and loudly and proudly, despite the sort of backlash that's happening right now. That is the way that we stay safe. And then events and actions, you know, International Working Women's Day is tomorrow. So there's a big event happening in Oakland. And then I also just wanted to flag for folks who are checking like the AROC events calendar, this is all the things that are happening just this weekend. Like there's a lot to do there. So it's just a soft reminder to check out the AROC calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events to see what's happening on the Palestine solidarity space in the Bay Area generally. You can also get text alerts by texting PSA to 833-633-0604. And of course, check out the PAL Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/sign up. And that's the end of it.
Sammer, thanks. Great to have you back. Before you go, I'm wondering if, you know, to your point about the bluster of Trump and what he's this the Middle East Riviera plan. Has there been any news about changes in U.S. troop deployments in the region since they came into office?
Yes, here and there, but nothing has actually happened as far as I'm aware. So, you know, Trump has been making noises about pulling out troops from Syria, for example. But that hasn't actually happened, and that's something that he said in his last administration too, and then never really meaningful. I mean, he did and then undid it. It was a whole thing. One thing we know is that there are U.S. security contractors on the ground in Gaza right now. That's something we talked about a few months ago. So it's not the U.S. military; it's private military contractors. But you know, the way that our country is moving, like for all intents and purposes, like that it's just a new version of the U.S. military. So it's not hard to imagine a scenario in which those people get into some sort of trouble, and then that leads to like increasing troop deployments. But I think we're still seeing this sort of tension within the MAGA coalition of the folks who want, you know, this more like isolationist wing that just want to pull the troops out to de-escalate with Iran to sort of, you know, reset, and then folks who are pushing for a more like old neocon style, like let's remake the whole region in our image. So not much.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. I think it's to your point, it's kind of it's a very different ball game because Trump is such an X factor and there are a lot more forces at play. So just we're gonna play a couple of those clips from our conversation with Bushra as we close out. The first clip is Bushra just talking a little bit about what the impact of the withholding of aid has had on Palestinians in Gaza, and then the final clip, which we'll queue up, will talk a little bit about her reflections on what's happening in the West Bank. So thanks again, Samar, and then we'll show these clips first.
Well, I mean, first of all, the number of tents that were supposed to enter did not all enter. So there was a specific number of tents, and I don't want to say the number wrong. It was a couple hundred, like a few 100,000 tents, and not all of them have entered. The same thing for the caravans, although the caravans, also are an issue, could be problematic in Gaza because caravans are not the solution. People should be rebuilding their homes. Gazans know how to rebuild their homes. They've rebuilt their homes, 5, 6, 7 times since, they've been living under the siege for 18 years almost now. So they know how to rebuild their homes. We want Palestinians in Gaza to return to their homes and rebuild them. And we don't want to put temporary shelter that might become long-term permanent, shelter and be also an excuse to not enter materials into Gaza. No, we need to enter cement. We need to enter machinery. We need to enter, removing the rubble is the #1 priority right now in Gaza, removing the rubble and removing the waste. So none of that machinery and equipment to be able to do that is entering. Education materials, kids have been out of school for 2 years in Gaza. Books, pens, pencils, sharpeners, that's what we're asking for. Are not entering Gaza. And, people, I mean, we have heroic teachers that are, teaching classes in makeshift camps and makeshift tents because, education is so important to the Palestinian people. It's, you've got a high literacy rate in Palestine and high education rate. Food stocks were already critically low. We don't have commercial routes open. Israel is not allowing for commercial routes. It should not be the responsibility of humanitarians to fix this. This is not a humanitarian problem, okay? We are there to support efforts on the ground, but we are not the solution. The solution first is a political one, and we need the market economy. If we want to rebuild Gaza, we need an economy. We need the private sector to reopen their businesses and get the private goods in. That's not happening. It's just food, medical, and the burden is on us. And so the world is looking at us like we have the answers. No, we do not have the answers. We are there to point at international law and remind people and parties, and all parties, not just Israel, not just de facto authorities, but also the international community, of the obligations and the legal duties under international law. And we're there to serve a population in need wherever they may be. That's it. We cannot negotiate the ceasefire. We should not be a bargaining chip in the ceasefire deal either. Hospitals in Gaza have collapsed.
Thanks for that.
And so the lack of medicine, electricity, and surgical supplies, that will mean a surge in preventable deaths, like I explained before, particularly among those wounded in the airstrikes and that are suffering, for example, from chronic conditions. And again, like I said, and you mentioned it, the thousands that are still living in these makeshift tents or literally living out in the open. It's cold here. It is like 5 degrees outside. Gaza's about a 2-hour drive, and they're on the sea, and it's windy. So without aid, people will freeze. Disease outbreaks will worsen, and deaths, from exposure will rise. Again, the lack of the clean water and sewage. As soon as it gets a little warm, these sewage pools that are, overflowing in Gaza are a recipe for disaster. That's disease and a disease outbreak right there, screaming in your face. And the thing that the fact that there's a lack of kind of medical care, it means that epidemics could spread just unchecked because you've got no capacity to check it, particularly among children and the elderly in Gaza. So, I mean, the ripple effect is appalling. It means that thousands will die because of the most common infection or virus. That's what it means, and we won't be able to understand the extent of it. because there's, again, no capacity to do these assessments. I am not a public health specialist. The organization I work for works a lot on water and sanitation, but also agriculture. So we work with farmers, for example, to try to, grow. At the moment, we're assessing any crops left that have been kind of like lightly damaged, to be able to see if we can revive the crops. But the thing is that, again, agricultural inputs are also on Israel's dual use list. So we can't enter any agricultural inputs or seeds or, tools for farmers to basically begin to farm again. But we're looking at strategies at how to do like urban gardens, etc. But again, removing the rubble is just of the essence for the medical infrastructure, because in order to prevent also the disease outbreak, you need to fix the water and sanitation issues, and we don't have enough fuel to fix that. We don't have the spare parts, and we can't enter them. So it's also the system is not just the hospital building. It's a system that's connected to that. It's the electricity poles to it and getting electricity into the hospital. And if it's not electricity, generators and enough fuel to run, a partial hospital. So, I can't, I can't speak to the medical kind of catastrophe that is waiting for us in Gaza, but it's already happening. I have my family in Gaza. My husband's family is all in Gaza. It's horrible for me to share this, but they have all had diarrhea for 18 months straight, because of the contaminated water they're drinking. And have been drinking contaminated water, whereas we know that people are drinking from wells that have not been basically pumped or cleaned, because there's no other choice. And again, the sewage issue is a big issue for hospitals as well. Those need to be, dealt with as a matter of urgency, and the same thing for the landfills. We need to be able to triage waste, in order to prevent those preventable diseases, so that the hospitals are dealing with the urgent cases and not, preventable deaths. It's absolutely incredible, truly, to see what has happened in Gaza. I was there in September 2023, and I still cannot believe my eyes at how we know of one medical health worker who was arbitrarily detained by Israel, and he went back to work 2 days later when he was released. He was released into Gaza, and he went back to the hospital to work. So the heroism of humanitarian workers and doctors and nurses and healthcare workers and UNRWA workers, honestly, it's been unparalleled, really. First of all, the number one thing is to make it very clear that humanitarian aid should not be a bargaining chip. We are not to be bargained with as a weapon
I
of
do want to
war.
just the
I
next
mean,
clip is
yeah, I'm glad that I
final
get
clip
to
is
speak
on
about it, because
Bush's
I'll
reflections
explain
on what's
just
happening in the
from
West
my
Bank.
personal perspective as a humanitarian worker, but also, a person living here and living under these conditions. My office is in Jerusalem. Uh, in miles, it's about 5.5 miles, 6 miles. So it should be a 30-minute drive. It took me about maybe 4 hours to get to Jerusalem last time because of the military checkpoints. And those have grown exponentially. They've always, controlled our movement and our entire kind of way of life for the last decades. But since 7th of October, and even more so since the ceasefire, restrictions have been, absolutely suffocating, where we're forced to take, back roads, and go through villages and go through detours in order to reach our destination. And these checkpoints are littered across the West Bank. They basically control every town and city and village at the exits and the entries of every town. And so Israel can effectively shut down the West Bank at its whim, and prevent anybody from moving from one city to the other. And that, of course, what happens, it means that, we're villages here. Our families are from one village and another, neighboring villages. It cuts, first of all, the family ties. It isolates villages from each other. There's a very strong sense of community still in Palestine, in the way we live and in the way of our lives. So that's number one. But also the economy has been an absolute free fall in the West Bank since 7th of October because of the movement restrictions, where, businessmen are not able to deliver on time, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the Operation Iron Wall that started in January in Jenin, but which is a continuation of the previous operations that have happened in the north, but now spread kind of through to Tubas, to Tulkarem, emptying the refugee camps, forcibly displacing these people who have nowhere to go, absolutely nowhere to go. They're like, and again, we have a strong strength of sense of community here. So people are, opening their homes to their neighbors, to their relatives to come and shelter with them. But who know, and Israel has said that they will not allow these people to return home. Where are these people supposed to go? And we're talking about, more than half are children and women
And
affected by.
these are poor communities, right? Like these are not people who are
These are
living.
refugee camps
These are
across the
refugee
West
camps.
Bank
Yeah.
in these major cities. These are the most vulnerable Palestinians, the poorest of Palestinians who are being forcibly displaced, along with, of course, the forcible displacement that we've been seeing for the last decades in Palestine. 2023 was a record number of forcible displacement in Palestine. In Area C, in like areas like South Hebron Hills, Masafir Yatta, you've heard of No Other Land today, talks
Hmm.
about Masafir Yatta and the forcible displacement, systematic forcible displacement that happens there because of settler attacks and Israeli military raids. So, I mean, the West Bank is absolutely, and then one more important point to talk about is that we have as many detainees now detained since the ceasefire than have been released. And this systematic and arbitrary system that basically arrests any Palestinian with no charge, with no evidence, and detains them administratively, indefinitely, in Israeli prisons, with subject to torture and inhumane treatment and absolutely appalling conditions. And that is basically the story of Palestinians at the moment in the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. While facing, of course, widespread demolitions and killings and settler violence, which is become a recurrent in our lives. So it's just completely been normalized,
Hmm.
this situation, absolutely normalized. It's normal that Palestinians should be subject to this level of violence on their daily lives. So yeah, it's a nightmarish, and the impact on us as humanitarians is that now we have these new laws that are annexing these lands in Area C. It means that we can't get to the most vulnerable communities. The people that need it the most, we can't reach them. We're not
Hmm.
allowed into the refugee camps to support these families. So we have to wait, in places where we can't reach. And that's again also against international law. It's not about just having aid. It's about making sure that that aid reaches the people that need it. And right now, we are definitely very much impacted. And I would definitely tell our audience here to go see our joint humanitarian access snapshot report, where we report how our aid operations have also been obstructed in very similar ways in the West Bank in the last month. And maybe you can share a link
I'll share
with our
that link.
audience so that they can, yeah. But yeah, it's the level of impunity that we are seeing on behalf of settlers, but also Israeli forces across the board is it's truly shocking. And the more we allow violations to go unchecked, the more this violence will fester and grow and the worst is yet to come.
So again, that's Bushra Khalidi. We'll include that in the recording that goes up on YouTube, hopefully later today. And again, thanks for joining us. We will be back next week with another PSA, and we'll stick around for just a couple of minutes to answer any outstanding questions. But thanks again. We'll see you next week.